Okay, welcome to tonight's hybrid event. My name is Mike Savage. I'm Emeritus Professor of Sociology here at the LSE, and I also direct a theme of research at the International Inequalities Institute around the questions of wealth and tax justice. And we are hosting tonight's amazing panel, which I am really looking forward to chairing. Just one word, one sentence from me, two sentences perhaps, about the issues tonight. The International Inequalities Institute was formed 2015, 9 years ago. And the argument we made was that the challenge of inequality was so great that we needed to pool ideas and research from across different departments. We couldn't just tackle it in siloed ways, because we saw the challenges of inequality being systemic. That was only 9 years ago. And if you look at what's happened in recent years about politics, about the social divides which we experience, it seems to me that things have indeed intensified much more quickly, actually, than we anticipated when we formed the International Inequalities Institute. So I think the role of institutes like ourselves is really, really important. And what we are trying to do is understand how inequality is not some kind of specialist topic. It informs so much of what we think about, understand, and it is shaping and reshaping our public and private lives in very fundamental ways. So today we are particularly exploring the question around how wealth inequality is driving and affecting forms of political engagement across the world, but with a particular focus, I think, on the UK. And we have an amazing panel who I'll introduce now. Byrne is Labour MP for Birmingham, Hodge Hill and Solihull North. He's a member of His Majesty's Privy Council, former William Gibbon Research Fellow at Nuffield College and Honorary Professor at the University of Birmingham. He also has a new book out on the inequality of wealth. I like to think of Liam, there's this great tradition of parliamentary intellectuals. This is not a party political point. Parliamentarians who really are committed to understanding the world in which they're living in and thinking about and try to change. We can say it has different party political complexions, but on the Labour Party side, it would include Tony Crosland, Tony Byrne, Michael Foot. If I'm honest, that tradition is not as strong as it has been in the past. I don't think it's a major criteria for being selected as a parliamentary candidate as to whether you are particularly well informed about what's going on in the world. But Liam, I see as the major exception. I see him as really standing for this kind of intellectually driven understanding of we need to understand the world if we can try and make it a better place. So fantastic, he'll kick off. And then we're moving on to Faiza Shaheen. Faiza is a distinguished policy fellow working with us now at the LSE and the International Inequalities Institute. We're delighted to have her working with us. She's one of the outstanding members of her generation in terms of being a change maker, a thinker, and someone with a proven record of campaigning work. She was director for a number of years of a think tank Class, founded by the trade unions, to try and make issues of class central to political debate. She worked for a number of years in New York University for the Pathfinders program, working with progressive governments around the world, think about how to develop new policies, tackle inequality. She has a new book out, well, recently new book out, which is, tell me what it's called.
Know Your Place.
Know Your Place. And it's fantastic to have her on the panel today. Jonathan Hopkin is Professor of Comparative Politics in the Department of Government at LSE. He has so you have three major book writers in this panel. His book came out in 2020, Anti-System Politics, was so powerful in encapsulating that we are seeing the rise of political parties who aren't trying to play the system, they're trying to break the system and challenge it from an outside position. He is an expert on thinking about what is happening in terms of the shaking up of liberal democratic values and practices. And it's a fantastic panel which straddles, scholarly work of the highest quality with campaigning and practical political work. So the plan will be each speaker will speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. And then we will have at least half an hour for question and answer. In that period, we will be taking some questions from the online audience and then also, and obviously from the floor. We will at that point ask, if those of you who want to ask questions, I'm sure there'll be many of you will ask you to identify who you are and your affiliation. Okay, no further ado from me. We're going to pass on to Liam to begin. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike, very much indeed. And it's a huge pleasure for me to be here tonight. And
you have to speak into the microphone.
I've got a mic.
Yeah,
so hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me at the back? Yes, great. It's a huge pleasure to be here tonight and to be with Mike. Mike is too modest to talk about actually his own books, which have been a huge influence on many of us who have been writing in this field for a long time. But above all, I wanted to just say thank you to you, because to let you into a secret, when you come along to do these things from Westminster, you never quite know whether anyone is actually going to turn up. And it's a fear for me that goes back almost 40 years to when I first joined the Labour Party at the tender age of 15. I celebrate 40 years of membership next year. And the first meeting I went to, I was introduced by someone called the party secretary, who rang me up once he'd found out that I joined and was only 15, and said, well, you should come along to this meeting that we've got tonight. And I thought that sounded very exciting. And then he said, well, and there's going to be an immense amount to drink. And as a 15-year-old, obviously, I thought this sounded exactly the kind of party that I want to be a member of. And then he said, well, but then I just got to warn you, and then there will be a fight. And I went to a reasonably violent comprehensive school, so I was kind of ready for this. And but he said, but don't worry. Then there'll be a big group hug and a song. And at this point, I was just sort of tearing up my membership card. But being too polite, I just said, well, okay, well, you know, what time would you like me to come along? And he just said, well, it doesn't matter. It's just going to be me and you. So whenever I come along to a meeting like this, and there's more than me and one other person in the audience, my heart sinks. So I'm going to talk very briefly tonight. Westminster is full of people who talk too much. I've got friends I've not spoken to for days because I didn't want to interrupt them. But so I'm going to basically say, just talk about three things tonight. And it's a provocation, because I just want to lay out an argument that I'd love to hear what you think. I'm going to talk about wealth. I'm going to talk about power. And I'm going to talk about the future. And our story starts 248 years ago with this guy. So everyone know this guy? Adam Smith, thank you very much. So 248 years ago, writes a book called The Wealth of the Nation. And the irony is that if we went out tonight and asked someone in the street what the wealth of this nation was, I mean, unless we went to the economics department, in which you get three different answers. But if we went out into the streets tonight and asked people what the wealth of the nation is, they wouldn't know. In fact, this is what has happened to the wealth of the nation. So since I was born in the holy town of Warrington back in 1970, the wealth of our nation has multiplied 100-fold. And when you look at this line, you see some quite curious patterns. So, for example, the sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed that the wealth of our nation has doubled through this strange period that we've just gone through called austerity. Now, how has that been true? Well, it's true because for some people, the last 15 years have been extraordinary. For everybody else, actually, the story has been rather different. So in constituencies like mine, we literally have food banks that are running out of food. But for the top 1%, you've seen this extraordinary boom in wealth of about £1 trillion. So this is wealth inequality data. And when you look at the last release that they've just supplied, you can see how things have changed. So for most of my life, wealth inequality was getting fairer. The way that we shared wealth was getting more equal. But since 2010, something fundamental has shifted. Since 2010, top 1% have soared off into a different kind of stratosphere. And that is why we now have this extraordinary moral emergency that divides our country, where on the one hand, we have almost the absurdity of affluence. We have record sales of super yachts. We have record sales of private jets. We have record sales of luxury cars. Literally, Rolls-Royce had one of the best years in their history just a couple of years ago. And yet, alongside that world, in the same country, we have food banks that are getting longer and longer and longer. And in constituencies like mine, the most income-deprived constituency in the country, you literally have food banks that are running out of food. And then when you just add up the numbers, the multipliers are extraordinary. So the top 1% has now grown their wealth by 41 times more than everybody else. 41 times. That is what has created this moral emergency of the inequality of wealth in our country. Now, even if you didn't care about whether some people were enjoying the fruits of their success and they were buying, luxury goods and they were leaning into that absurdity of affluence, this is why you should care. Because when you look around the world, unequal countries have got three things in common. By and large, they are poorer because those at the very top have a nasty habit of avoiding their taxes. In fact, if everybody in the top income bracket, in the top wealth bracket, was paying their correct marginal rate of tax, we would have about 22 billion pounds coming in extra to the Treasury each and every year. So unequal countries quite quickly become poorer countries. The public realm becomes diminished. But second, they become corrupt because you get the growth of what economists call this rent-seeking behavior. And you can see that certainly in America. Look at the cabinet that has just been appointed by President Trump. But the reality is you can see it up the road where I work in Westminster too. I have been an MP now for 20 years. I have never seen big money stalk the corridors of Westminster like I see today. And in fact, the way that wealth seeps into politics today is more insidious than perhaps you would think. So it's not, strangely enough, about the free glasses and the football tickets and the suits, as egregious as all of that is. It's about people buying TV stations. It's about those TV stations hiring particular politicians to present their news. It's about the money that goes into think tanks. It's about the ecosystem of power and ideas. That's how politics begins to get corrupted and corroded from the inside. And that, in turn, helps ensure that countries become more stagnant. Why? Because social mobility collapses. Where you have inequality, guess what? You have those who are luckiest, those who are most fortunate, begin to try and protect, preserve, and hold on to the privileges they enjoy and cascade them down the generations. And so social mobility begins to go in reverse. It now takes 5 generations for someone born in this country, in the lowest income bracket, for their heirs to rise up and even make average wages. That's how broken social mobility has now become in our country. And guess what? On election day, those problems show up. Now, when I was researching this book, some of the research was more interesting than other bits of the research. There's quite a lot of economics and there's quite a lot of data and there's quite a lot of graphs. But actually, in a funny way, one of the starting points for the book was this kind of mass anxiety dream that we appear to be having. Because when you look at our culture, this is just a sort of a small selection of the shows that I've had to kind of watch. My favorite is probably Below Deck, Above Deck, Below Deck. Season 11 is the best if you haven't had a chance to tune in. But what is going on here? Why have we now got this kind of abundance of wealth porn in online streaming land? It's because we're having a mass anxiety dream. Culture is how we cope with the reality around us. And what we are trying to do in these kind of shows that we all kind of enjoy is basically try and relax. We try and grasp onto a sense that these people may be richer than us, but actually they're really quite nasty. They're quite snitty to each other. They're quite unpleasant. They're not proper human beings. It's a comfort factor. It's kind of comfort watching. Our culture is trying to tell us something. Our culture is trying to tell us that something is going wrong and we should be worried about it. And that worry, that anxiety shows up on election day with the election of people like this. And so I have now become increasingly convinced that the kind of wealth inequality that is now dividing our society has got a very significant political effect that all of us should be worried about for the future. Now, I was first kind of switched on to this by the work of Ben Ansell. Some of you will have come across it. He gave a great set of Reith lectures at Christmas. And back in 2020, Ben and Professor Adler noticed something quite interesting. They basically noticed that there was this relationship between wealth and your attraction to populists. And so what Ben noticed is that when you looked at the Brexit vote, basically those who had kind of bigger, richer houses were much less likely to vote for populists than anybody else. But then that analysis was then applied to America, it would apply to Scandinavia, it was applied to France, and pretty much everywhere you looked, what they found is that those places, the people in those places where wealth growth had fallen behind were the places that were much more likely to vote for Brexit, for Trump, for Le Pen, and for the far right in Scandinavia. So what I thought I would do is have a look at the election that has just happened. And these are the results. So this is pretty rough and ready stuff. But I should say the data that we have about household wealth in our country is pretty poor. It's quite poor at mapping the amount of wealth at the top because there's quite a lot of avoidance and hiding of assets. And it's not great at the bottom either. But what you can basically see, if you basically look at the change in aggregate wealth over the course of just over 10 years, so from 2006 through to about 2020, and then you map the reform vote, you see this extraordinary pattern. So in the southeast of the country, where wealth growth has actually been greatest, the reform vote has been lowest. In places like the northeast, where wealth growth has been weakest, you see the reform vote that has been highest. When you then look at the 20 constituencies where the reform vote was highest, once again, you see this curious set of patterns emerge. So as you might expect, in big reform voting constituencies, they're less diverse than the national average. You've got many fewer people with level 4 qualifications. Actually, the house prices have lagged behind pretty significantly, and you've got much, much higher levels of deprivation. So arguably the places that are showing up in terms of a bigger reform vote are the places where the economy has left people behind. And then if you just, I won't dwell on this too long because it's a bit complicated, but every dot is a constituency. And what you begin to see here again is that if you just sort of look at the percentage of people living in some form of deprivation, and then you map the reform vote in those constituencies, again, you seem to get this very interesting frontier effect. So basically, the ceiling on the reform vote gets higher as deprivation goes up. And as constituencies get richer, the ceiling on the reform vote begins to fall. In fact, what you can roughly see here is every 10% drop in deprivation sees, roughly speaking, a 10% fall in the reform vote. So it would seem that there is this relationship between wealth, a lack of growth in wealth, and a propensity to vote for populists. And then when you kind of dig in, there's not a massive amount of analysis in the polling data, but you can see how amongst reform voters, there is this sense of frustration and anger and I think an appetite to keep repressing the reset button, which is why I think the argument about anti-system politics is so important. So what does this mean for the future? Well, this is a bit of work that actually Will Snell and others have done, which has been looking at how reform voters think about the next kind of 4 or 5 years. And what is really striking, there are two things on this graph that are really striking. So if you look at how reform voters think about their standard of living over the next 5 years, only 10% of reform voters think that their standard of living is going to improve. Now look at the level of trust that reform voters express in the system. Just 8% of reform voters think that their confidence in the system, their trust in government, will go up. 75% think it's actually going to go down. And my argument to you tonight is that this is something that we should all care about, because if the market for populism is going to grow, that is a peril for the politics of this country in the future. And the bigger problem is that people are right to be worried. So this is the OBR's analysis from October. This is what happens to their forecast of real wages over the course of this parliament. And you can see in 2026, 2027, that should say, real wages actually fall below zero. Now, where else has that just happened? It's just happened in America. If you look at the bottom 50% of workers in America, if you look at their real wages, their real income, they are actually worse off at the end of the Biden presidency than they were at the beginning. And guess what? That anger showed up on election day. So we have to have a debate in this country about how we're going to fix things for the future. And the argument in the book is this argument for not universal basic income, but universal basic capital. The idea that you give everybody universal savings accounts. You pay into those bank accounts for those who are young, a one-off citizens' dividend of about £10,000. You might give that money in the form of a tax credit. You might give it in the forms of savings match. You might give it in forms of cash. But we've got to start helping the next generation begin to grow their wealth and assets in a way that we simply aren't doing today. Where does that £10,000 come from? Well, it could come from a new sovereign wealth fund. 80 countries around the world have got those sovereign wealth funds. You would need to build up a fund of about 200 billion in order to give every single young person about £10,000 a year. How on earth would you get 200 billion? Well, carefully, methodically, over the course of the parliament, it is possible if you return fairness to the tax system. This is a bit of polling that I did with King's and with the Fairness Foundation, which was just looking at how people think about restoring fairness to the tax system. The thing that I want you to take away from this picture is actually the gap between Labour voters and Conservative voters is not very great. Even when you go to this idea of introducing an annual wealth tax on the 22,000 fortunes, which are worth over 10 million, you can see there's not a gigantic gap in the polling between the level of support for that. So there can be no progress on wealth inequality unless we restore fairness to the tax system. And of course, I want you to read my book about how we do that. But if you haven't got the appetite to read a whole book, there is just one page that I want you to read, and it's this page. I don't know here how many people have read Rishi Sunak's tax return. Well, none of you? It's not very long. It's only a page. He only publishes a page. So, and here it is. And so this is from last year when Mr. Sunak was still living in Downing Street. And the numbers that stand out are these numbers. So this is 2 million quid's worth of income. Nice if you can get your hands on that kind of income each year. Tax paid, 23%. So how on earth can someone on £2 million be paying just 23% in tax? Because if you take your money in the form of investment income, you pay a much lower rate of tax, even after the budget that we just saw last week, 2 weeks ago. So if we are serious about genuinely avoiding the peril of populism in the future, it seems pretty clear to me that we've got to start taking action now about fixing wealth inequality. Where do we start? We start with those at the sharp end, who are our young people. How do we pay for it? By restoring fairness to the tax system. I think that that is an argument that we can win. I suppose the final point that I wanted to make really is just the point about what's at stake. Because right now we are trapped in the politics of gloom. And actually, if you think about the next 5 to 10 years, it could be extraordinary. If you think about the revolution in artificial intelligence, or global gigabit connectivity, or the transition to green energy, there are 90% of the scientists who are ever lived are alive and are working today. The things that they will do, the things that they will create, the things that they will invent, transforms our options, our agency, our opportunities for the future. That will unleash the creation of all sorts of wealth for the future. And we could use that wealth to transform the kind of freedoms that each and every one of us have. But the big insight we've got to hold on to is that ultimately there is no freedom without security, and there is no security without wealth. And that's why we should be seeking to revive an idea in politics that is as old as Plato, not simply rebuilding the wealthy democracy, but trying once again to build the democracy of wealth. And I'd love to know what you think. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Liam. And now on to Faiza.
There you go. Okay. Hello. I don't have a mic attached to me, so quite annoying because I can't see some of you. I'll just keep doing this. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about really the language of wealth inequality and how we're seeing that language used across the board. And what that means in terms of how our political system is working and who it's appealing to. I've been thinking a long time about inequality, and I think the ways in which it's converting into political outcomes has worried me more and more in recent years. And in the previous role I held at New York University, I got to travel around and work with governments all around the world. And having worked in the UK for a really long time, I was really struck by how I kept hearing the same thing, but in a different language. So in that work, we had a group of sort of progressive left governments that we were working with, progressive left, centre or centre left. And all of a sudden we would lose countries in that 3-4 years. We would lose governments. And one of the things that we did was like try and talk to some of those ministers and policymakers that we had been working with as they fell out of government. And in South Korea, I heard about how gender division was used by the right. So it's a pretty homogenous population in terms of race and immigration. But what they had done there is that they had told young men that the reason you can't find a job is because young women are taking your jobs now. The reason you can't find housing is because actually now there's too much equality. This government is too focused on equality. I heard that in South Korea. In Costa Rica, often thought about as the country with the highest well-being in the world and is a lovely place. The left government had been kicked out because the right had conducted a big push to say, actually, this government, who had got through gay marriage, which was a big deal in Costa Rica because it's a Catholic country, only cares for the gays. They only care about the gays. They don't care about you. I mean, never mind the fact that this government had done some good stuff on material well-being, but all of that kind of was ignored because of this really strong story the right had to tell. And I saw that again and again in the different countries that I worked in, the use of division. So how is inequality translating into what I would say as regressive and worrying political outcomes, where the far right and the right are taking control of government? We can't be too simplistic about how that's happening. It doesn't just happen. There should be a world, and there are countries we can look at where wealth inequality has gone up, and instead of the right doing well, the left has done well. Right? What does that look like? I was working with Spain. We were really worried about the Spanish election coming up because Vox, the far right party, was doing really well. But actually, Sanchez, the centre-left party and the left party were able to mobilize, work together and push back in the last Spanish elections. Last year, Vox actually, the far right party, saw their vote share fall. So, I think we have to be careful in recognizing the mechanisms that are resulting in wealth inequality translating into the worrying political outcomes. And I think there's various different things I could talk about. People talk about the role of social media and misinformation, and the role, of course, of how the economy is working, who it's working for. But I'm going to focus on the narrative, and I'm going to do some audience participation and try and get you to guess who said what. So let me start with this one. At the center of the rigged economy are powerful corporations, media elites, and political dynasties. I want you to imagine how much better our future can be if we declare independence from the elites, who've led us to one financial and foreign policy disaster after another. These are US and UK leaders of the last 8 years. Anyone want to take a guess at who that is? It is Trump. I'm just double checking because I have to forget. All right, the next one. This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. We have fought against the multinationals. We have fought against the big merchant banks. We have fought against big politics. We have fought against lies, corruption, and deceit. Raj? This will be a reckoning for those who thought they could get away with asset stripping our industry, crashing our economy through their greed and ripping off workers and consumers. Jeremy Corbyn. These rules have created a cozy cartel which rigs the system in favor of a few powerful and wealthy individuals and corporations. It's a rigged system set up by the wealth extractors for wealth extractors. Bernie, yeah. Act like I know him by his first name. There is an irrational, unhealthy, and growing gap between what these companies pay their workers and what they pay their bosses. I know it's a bit tricky, you might have already forgotten her, Theresa May. But okay, so you can look across the language of what we would see as the right and indeed the left, and you will see actually quite similar language. Now, we might say, oh, the cheek of Trump and Farage, they themselves recognize are the elite. You know, you might say, well, look at who they're hiring. But this language of inequality, wealth inequality, is there. It's like the first part of their speeches are the same, and it works. The difference is the second part, right? Like, what are the solutions? And like Farage would say, you know, massive migration, massive migration is still hopelessly out of control. So you'll use the first part, and then it'll say the problem is these immigrants. Now the left might say something different, but we don't really have a left in this country. For those of you that know me may know that I was one of the few left socialists running as a candidate, and I was unceremoniously blocked from running at the very last minute. I still ran as an independent, and I'll talk about that in a second. So this is one answer that is presenting to us, right? From that, and again, you know, I saw some version of this in many of the countries I was working in around the world. Is the answer this? Now, I don't know if you guys saw this, but I just found it so interesting, and I'll explain why. So Keir Starmer tweeted this a few days ago. I'm determined to deliver growth, create wealth, and put more money in people's pockets. So a recognition that we need to do something about material well-being, which, you know, of course, is central to what any government should do. This can only be achieved by working in partnership with leading businesses like BlackRock to capitalize on the UK's position as a world-leading hub for investment. For those of you that know about BlackRock, BlackRock is a nefarious, biggest asset owning company in the world. I mean, bigger than most countries. That's the wealth they have, apart from, I think, the US and China. Defense companies, fossil fuels, you know, unaffordable housing. If you look into it, it's pretty, you know, a pretty good shorthand for capitalism. But what I think was more interesting than this tweet and this partnership was the response. And if you look at, I looked at the tweets underneath, I went into this rabbit hole. I looked at the tweets underneath, and you look at who was responding and what they were saying. And you had someone like Mike Galsworthy, who is a kind of, probably a very strong, you can see it there, with pro-EU, maybe centre-left. James Foster, who was like a big champion for Corbyn. Then you have all these right and far-right reform people responding. I mean, look at the likes. So there's a few things I want you to know about this. The anger, absolutely, but also just, right, so this thing Carl Benjamin says, for instance, he's actually proud to be selling us out to BlackRock. Right, this guy is far right. This woman, I mean, I'll just go in and like click on all of their tweets and see what they're saying. Leilani Dowding, well, I'm not gonna read that out. we knew you had paymasters, right? So actually the right concoct this story about BlackRock and the rich in a conspiracy framing. So they use this sense of like, you know, shadowy figures that are taking over. But the thing that worried me is that whilst the left was responding, and there was more from the left. So there was, I mean, have a look yourself and click on their, click to look at the other sorts of things that they're tweeting to get a sense of who these people are. This guy was like, Bill Gates and BlackRock are your masters. This European power was, BlackRock is one of the most powerful and utterly corrupt shadow banking outfits in the world. So this was more of a kind of left criticism. But look at the number of likes. And I know Twitter is a weird place, but I'm just saying, look at the number of likes the far right were getting. So Robert Lowe, Carl Benjamin, Lily, like 40,000, 35,000, whereas some of even my friends on the left that were replying were getting in the hundreds. And I just find it interesting, and I find it worrying how much the story of wealth inequality is being taken and used by the right, and is being used so effectively and is getting so much attention. So what is the answer? So the answer coming from the right is, you know, we know the story, the Trump story, the immigration, etc. From the government, from Labour, centre-left, you're hearing we will work with these companies these companies who the right say are like these shadowy figures, and the left, you know, people like me will say, well, actually, I don't see that these companies are going to deliver to reduce inequality, given that they're one of the major reasons that we have, you know, one of the major drivers of inequality in the world, not just here. So I guess the thing that I want to say when we're thinking about this is the real worry about where the answer comes from in this country. As someone, I can see Mike looking at going on too long. I think many of us were really struck by the riots in the summer. I think they've been very quickly forgotten. I can tell you as a Muslim that most of my family and a lot of my Muslim friends wouldn't leave the house at that time. And we had a government that could barely say the word Islamophobia, right? And many of us feel that they didn't have our back, and racism in this country isn't being properly confronted. And that is a core part of the rights narrative. Islamophobia is a core part of it, and we saw that blow up. What can we do then? I want to get into this more, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are, because some of this is just preliminary thinking, just to be honest, from me, you know, the last week. What can we do, and what have I seen other countries do? And absolutely, we should be looking at taxes. We should be looking at things. I love the idea of giving everyone a capital fund, giving everyone some capital. I think where I saw things like this work in other countries is that it was termed around the solidarity tax. And what that meant is that it had a very strong narrative about you are giving to the next generation, or you're paying for a particular crisis in this moment. We're coming together around a particular issue. We're going to be super transparent about how this money is spent. And there's this very specific thing we're going to do with it. So the reason that people, for instance, are very committed and very much against inheritance taxes, often, even when they don't have to pay it themselves, is because emotionally they understand the idea that people want to give things to their kids. So how do you take that emotion and be honest about it and say, okay, well, let's think about how we talk about this in a way that we are giving to the next generation. How do we build an emotional story around this that people can get back behind? And I think the stuff that happened or is happening with the farmers' wealth tax, which is kind of quite incredible. It's not a big shift, but it's, you know, in terms of the tax, but such a big backlash, is partly because, yeah, the wealthy will push back, partly because I think there are some issues with the way it's been designed. And thirdly, because there wasn't enough work done on the story and the narrative around why we should do this. There needed to be a bit more of a lead in. It shouldn't have just come out of the blue. I also want to say that we need to be doing much, much more in terms of empowering individuals on the ground. I ran a campaign when I was kicked out of the Labour Party, or we ran a campaign because it was very much a group effort. I mean, we weren't expecting to do it, but we were pushed to do it locally. And in 4 weeks, we got 12,500 votes. And it was like, I think 60 less votes than what the Labour Party got. In 4 weeks, the Labour Party's been around 125 years. And what was interesting in doing that work, so I ran in Chingford and Woodford Green, which has been a Tory seat forever, is the number of people that said to me, I was going to vote for a reform, but now I'm going to vote for you. And I couldn't understand it. I mean, my politics are the complete opposite of reform. And the reason why, and AOC in the US just did this little experiment as well, asking people, for those that voted for her and Trump, was because you're against the system. You're authentic. I can understand what you're saying. So there is a big push in terms of the number of people that are questioning the political system and looking for people and looking for a political party that will stand up for themselves. And it is not inevitable. It's not inevitable that the answers will come from the right. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faiza. That's brilliant. And now on to Jonathan.
Okay. No, hit that. I don't have any. Okay, so here's the boring bit. That was supposed to be a joke. It's supposed to giggle with amusement. But I guess that's what you're already thinking. But at least, you know, I didn't produce the deck of slides that maybe I could have done, unfortunately, because Liam in particular presented a lot of the data that I would have presented. So I share a lot of the diagnosis that both the previous speakers have laid out, and I'm very sympathetic to the solutions they're talking about too. I guess what I'm going to do is just offer a little bit more of a dull academic take on some of these problems, and a way of interpreting some of the data that was presented. So the first point I'd like to make is that the way in which wealth, the total volume of wealth in Britain, but similar things have been happening in other Western countries, has soared at the same time as the economy has appeared to be stagnating. And in Britain, it certainly has been doing, but even outside, with the exception, partial exception of the United States, most of Europe has been growing very, very slowly, if at all, as well. And this has coincided with a boom in wealth. So this is telling you something. What it's telling you is that the very wealthy don't need the economy to grow for them to benefit. It's not necessary. Thomas Piketty, who some of you may have heard of, is the kind of rock star economist who wrote this very powerful book a decade ago, Capital in the 21st Century, made the argument that wealth tends to accumulate, capital tends to accumulate. This is an argument you may have heard before from other sources, and he presents a lot of data to show that, and has a sort of theory on which that data sits, which is that, you know, the share, if we think of the GDP of an economy and the way in which income is shared out between different factors of production, between capital, investors on the one hand, and workers, everyone else on the other, then because of the way capital tends to enjoy a higher return than the rate of economic growth, the share of income going to capital, going to investors, will grow over time, irrespective of what the economy is doing, unless the level of economic growth is higher than the rate of return, which basically never happens. And so his argument was that capitalism is going to inevitably produce an increasing share of the economy going to the wealthy. And the problem is that capital is mostly owned by the wealthy. And this leaves us with a big problem with capitalism that makes it incompatible really with a first society. That capital with almost mathematical precision tends to make the rich richer at everybody else's expense. Of course, if economic growth is high, you can attenuate that effect. You can not only increase average incomes, which is a good thing, but you can also increase or counteract the ways in which investors take a greater and greater share. So economic growth is really important, and this is a part of the story I think we need to talk about. We need to talk about how to get the economy growing again, as well as how we redistribute income and wealth. Second point is that yes, wealth is extremely unequally distributed, but I'm a bit more skeptical than our other speakers about the capacity, our ability to resolve our problems by taxing the very wealthy. One of the reasons that's been mentioned already, which is that the very wealthy have a lot of influence over the political system. You only have to look at the net wealth of the incoming Trump administration to see that wealthy people are able to buy influence, they are able to bully politicians, and they are also able, and without even showing their faces or buying newspapers or standing as candidates, they are able to also threaten governments by the implicit or explicit threat to withdraw their capital. Now, capital has mobile and immobile forms, right? So more mobile forms of capital are essentially a loaded gun pointed at the head of any government that has progressive aims. So this is a big problem with seeking to pursue redistribution of wealth as a strategy. There are a lot of very powerful people with a lot of resources and a lot of ability to threaten us that stand in this way, in the way of it. But another problem is that wealth is very unequally distributed, but still quite a large share of wealth is held by fairly normal people. Now, the bottom half of the wealth distribution in the UK has less than 5% of the wealth. So around half of society has basically no wealth. And obviously, this means that there are potentially large share of voters who could be brought around to a redistributive project. And the top 1% has, according to the ONS, 21% of the wealth. Hugely disproportionate share. But, you know, that still leaves, you know, 70% or so of the wealth to be accounted for. Around half of that is in the rest of the top 10%, and around the other half is in the sort of people between the median and the top 10%. So these are not wealthy people, or certainly don't see themselves as wealthy people. They're certainly wealthier than the people in the bottom half, but they're kind of ordinary people, people with ordinary jobs, people who, increasingly people of about my age and above who were lucky enough to start earning wages when houses were still affordable. So, you know, there are some obstacles. It's nice to think there's a stock of wealth sitting there waiting to be taxed, but we need to think about how we tax it, and we need to think of how we tax it in a smart way. One fantastic way, I think, is to take aim at immobile assets. Farms are a possible example. I think the reaction to the sort of fairly modest proposal to tax, to levy inheritance taxes on farms gives you an idea of just how much armory the wealthy have. But of course, that's no reason not to take them on. And what I would say is if you're these people are going to object to anything a progressive government does, if we want to call the current government a progressive one, certainly more so than the previous ones, I think. If you're going to take that political hit, you may as well hit them hard, right? If you're going to be hated by the wealthy, you may as well, within the constraints of what allows an economy to function, you should, you know, do it properly. Okay. Next point I would make is that, which is relating a bit to also this question of growth. Yes, wealth, you know, wealth is booming in the UK. It's very unequally held, but a lot of that wealth is founded on debt. Now, the total indebtedness of British households has been declining since about 2010. So it had reached, I think, 160% of GDP, dropped down to 120% of GDP, but that's still a lot, right? So the flip side of wealth is debt, right? On the other side of the equation, there are debtors. Some people's debts, and I see a rather young audience in front of me, some people's, the younger generation's debts correspond to assets held by richer and generally older people. So part of the accumulation of wealth is an accumulation of wealth based on leverage. People borrowed money, were lucky with the timing, and became very wealthy. And the housing boom is a big part of that. Obviously, the houses are pretty much the same. You know, most of the housing stock in the UK is quite old. Most of these houses that are now worth millions of pounds in London used to be worth a fraction of that. They were pretty much the same houses, right? They might have had a fewer kitchen islands and that kind of thing, but they're basically the same kinds of assets. So in a sense, the big problem with housing isn't so much how we extend this, you know, lottery win to more and more people. It's how we provide people with housing. And hopefully by doing that, we can sort of gently puncture this ridiculous bubble, speculative bubble that has developed. And again, you know, doing anything about that creates a lot of opposition. But, you know, Britain is a fairly densely populated country, but I live in East Yorkshire. Whenever I head north to see my family, I notice that between London and Beverley, where I grew up, there's basically nothing. It's empty. There's loads of room to build houses. Build these houses, build the transport connections to allow people to have access to economic opportunities. So I think what I'm kind of edging towards here is an idea that in a way is a little bit in conflict with what Liam in particular is saying. I think actually who has the potential to put capital in the hands of the people? Well, the government can do that by writing checks for people. And if you've got, the fiscal capacity to do that, that would be a great idea. But the government also has the ability to do it on behalf of the people in general by creating public goods. Public housing is a public good. A transport infrastructure, which is properly subsidized and workable, is a public good. And these things generally are good for the economy as well. They're good for the economy in the short term because they give people jobs making these things, and they're good for the economy in the longer term because they create economic opportunities and create the capacity for the economy to grow. So my preference really is for the government to do all this stuff, to direct investment and to use the credit rating of a government, which isn't the best perhaps after Liz Truss, but is still pretty good compared to most of us as individuals. People will lend money to governments at much lower rates. And government should take the opportunity to use that, even though national debt is very high. So we've heard this story over and over again, but the governments can still borrow money. The current government is trying to do that, and it can invest it in trying to make the economy grow in a way which is, you can do that in an equitable way, you can do that in a less equitable way. But the kinds of things I'm talking about would generally be a benefit to a much wider range of people than, the capital returns that Thomas Piketty was talking about. Next point is that, and again, this runs a little bit against what Liam was saying, is that, although I'm sure he will agree with me, but it's a slightly different emphasis, I think, which is that why is wealth so important for us culturally and for us politically in the UK? It's because it's the only safety net we've got, right? Why is it so important for people to have net worth? Because if something goes wrong, okay, in your family, someone gets sick, needs care, the government is no longer, the public sector is no longer able to provide that at the standards people expect. Same with healthcare, to some extent also education. University fees, some people like to pay them so that their kids don't get into debt to get an education. All of these things, we're having to build up wealth to essentially protect ourselves from the uncertainty which comes from a government which doesn't have our back. And these risks are very often, some risks are unpredictable, okay? Nobody knew the financial crisis was coming, although afterwards everybody knew why it had happened. But a lot of risks we face in a modern economy are extremely predictable. They're probabilistic. We know on average how long people are likely to live. We can update as time goes on our estimates, but we pretty much know what the liabilities of the state for paying pensions and so on are going to be. So let's do more of that together rather than leaving it in the hands of private individuals who A, cannot bear the risk individually very well. Most people don't have enough wealth to do that. B, don't really know how to protect themselves because only the people at the very top have the expertise to invest their money and get the best returns. Thomas Piketty talks about this as well, by the way. The more money you have, the better return you get because you can get good advice and you can take more risk. So, leaving it to individuals is a much less efficient way of doing things than allowing what we used to call a welfare state to do this same job. And this doesn't, of course, and I think one of my sort of gripes with British political culture is this idea that welfare is all about redistribution. Yes, we're a very unequal society. We need redistribution. We need much more of it than we have. But the welfare state is also about self-insurance. It's about protecting yourself now against risks you're going to face in the future. And if the government is doing that, which it can do much more easily than we can as individuals, it relieves us of the stress of having to build up our own nest egg, which most people are unable to do when wages are as low as they are for most people. So people need security. Giving them wealth might help them do that. but providing, as a public good, that assurance is more efficient, more equitable. And final point, and I see the clock is ticking. How do we do that? And I guess this reveals how old-fashioned I am and nostalgic, which is ultimately the government has to do these things. We've had 40 years of neoliberalism, 40 years of this idea that markets solve problems if only we leave them alone. Even the neoliberals don't really believe that anymore. It is an idea that's had its time, but of course we're still scrambling around to try and think about what might replace it. But I've got an idea. Let's just go back to what we were doing before. It wasn't perfect, but the idea of a democratically elected government, which is acting on the behalf of the people as a whole, allowing, of course, the dynamism of markets where that actually arises to generate prosperity for people. But of course, where it fails, and it fails very often, the government has to step in through regulating things smartly, not stopping people building houses in the wastelands of East Anglia. But, not to be offensive to East Anglians, I did live there for a few years. Doing smart regulation and smart government spending and smart investment in people and in infrastructure and in housing to allow an economy to work. Failing to coordinate how we do these things, leaving it to the market and making the entire population anxious about how much wealth they can build up clearly isn't working. It wasn't working before because even when the economy was growing, we had high inequality and a lot of insecurity. Now we have that plus an economy that isn't growing anymore. So enough is enough. We need to think about how the government can coordinate growing the economy through investment. And I think the current government timidly is taking steps toward this, but also making sure that the government takes responsibility for the fact that as a society, we are all looked after, which is not impossible. Countries next door to us all do this. They all complain about the taxes they have to pay for it, but it's not that much more than we're paying now for a society which manifestly failed to do that for so many people. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, that's a great discussion. Three, related but also subtly different arguments. Sometimes not so subtly, but that's lots to talk about. So we're going to throw it out for question and answer. And we have some questions online. If you're online, you can put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get some of those later. If you're in the audience, please raise your hand. What we'll do is we'll get 2 or 3 questions gathered up, and then we'll allow the panel to respond. So when you ask your question, please just say who you are and what your affiliation is, so we get a sense of where you're coming from. That'd be brilliant. Yeah, so let's start with you. Yeah, wait for the microphone.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm a teacher of economics at Mill Hill County, and my question to you is, has there been a time in history when wealth inequality has actually come down? And if that's the case, then can it then be said that the rise of populism is just a symptom because of an already existing problem? Yeah,
Thank you. Park that question for now. And yeah, you over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Todd. I'm doing a PhD in competition law at University College London. So, Liam, I loved your talk, except the end. You talked about technology and the possibilities, the end, sorry. Yeah, you talked about technology, the possibilities for growth from AI, gigabit technology, et cetera, et cetera. But if we look at the wealth that gets generated from that, it's captured very often by increasingly monopolies, concentrated industries, et cetera, which are in turn owned by rich people. So it seems, for want of a better word, a bit naive to think that we can tax this and redistribute it because it will continually be captured and captured and captured. And those firms are often owned offshore in the US, think about big tech, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, do you really think it's possible to address this issue through taxation or explicitly taxation? If so, why? And perhaps should we be addressing corporate concentration, anti-monopolization, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you very much.
One more. Is there anything? That's one at the back here. At the back, the woman in the white jacket, the white jumper. Yeah. Yes. No. That's it. Take 'em.
Sorry, got a bit confused. Hi, I'm Maria. So I just graduated last year from my master in social policy, and now I work in local government. And I can definitely agree with the point about more public realm investment because councils are going bankrupt, as a lot of people might know. So I have one question that's a bit long, mostly for Liam, but also for everyone else. So I was curious about your choice to focus on constituencies that voted primarily Reform. And that's because I think it can tell this dangerous narrative about, people who vote for the extreme right wing are, impoverished or, face deprivation. But, what about when you focus on constituencies, you're not taking into account the mass of people who aren't voting, and you can see that as an anti-system vote, right? This election has been 40% not voting. And in fact, we know that more deprived areas in the UK have lower voter turnout. You're also not thinking about the people who can't vote. Children don't vote. They're also overrepresented. And impoverished people, migrants don't vote. I'm a migrant. I can't vote. So my voice isn't going to be captured by any sort of voting thing. So yeah, what about what was the choice of focusing on constituencies when in fact we could also focus at the general Reform voters, and they tend to be more spread across, social classes. They tend to be older. Also, if we look at, the Leave vote, it was mostly middle-class people, like 60%, because middle-class people were most of the people who voted. So I think also around that rhetoric of, wealth inequality and populism, and reminding that there's a lot of well-off people who also vote for the extreme right. And my second question, which is very short, is if people can talk about, what about the fact that we don't have third spaces, like investment in public infrastructure? How does that impact populism? Like, we don't really talk to each other, right? We have different media, and any sort of third spaces like children's centers or community hubs, they're not being funded. We don't have those spaces to talk to each other. So we're all a lot more, economically, the spaces we access are very economically defined. Thank you.
So three great questions. Liam, would you like to start?
Yeah, just brilliant questions. Thank you. And they all
You got-
kind
you
of,
got-
connect. So the best books that have been written about the very, very long run of inequality have got a couple of sort of quite stark conclusions. So one is that if you go back to neo-Roman times, you compare the wealth of the very richest with the wages of an average worker, that's about the same ratio as we have in Britain today. So that's how, at its extreme, that's how bad wealth inequality has become today. The second slightly sad conclusion is that, again, over the very long run, the big moments when wealth inequality has really shifted entail mass warfare or mass revolution. And so the challenge that I think we've got in politics today is that if we don't want a mass war and we don't want a revolution, what's the reformation that lies between the times? And that's why these debates tonight are just so important in informing our politics. And my question, and the book is written as a provocation, is to say, well, look, there are ways in which there are tried and tested ways in which you can fix wealth inequality, not kind of overnight, but slowly. And, a lot of that analysis begins with Piketty, but what Piketty misses is this extraordinary phenomenon of quantitative easing. So we've had £850 billion go into our monetary system. That's held interest rates down by about 1%. Those lower interest rates have triggered about 3/4 of the increase in wealth that we've seen over the last 15 years. That prize has gone overwhelmingly to those who owned assets, who happen to pay half the rate of tax of everybody else. So the system we've got is based on what James Mead used to call, to those who have shall be given. Public policy is leaning in to wealth inequality in a really big way. And you can't decompress wealth inequality once it has started without wealth taxation of some sort. And there's probably about 10 well-developed ways of doing this. Andy Summer, who is here at the LSE, has helped launch the new Centre for Taxation, which is from our point of view in Westminster, is one of the most important innovations in public policy right now. So this debate about tax has got to continue, because ultimately you can't decompress the wage inequality we've got without wealth tax. Now that's what takes me to your question, sir, about is that enough? And the answer is no, because you're right to say that our economy right now is bedeviled by the kind of rent-seeking behaviour that drives returns increasingly to the top. And it's unbelievably difficult to get data on this, but if you break down the HMRC corporate tax returns, what you can see is that about 44% of UK corporate profits are now in sectors that are prone to rent-seeking behaviour. 44%. That is an enormous slice of our economy that is now tied up in rent-seeking. And so the kind of reforms that Lena Khan has been trying to prosecute in the Federal Trade Commission, they are supremely important here. The reality is our Competition and Markets Authority has fundamentally failed to deliver the competitive environment that we should have in this country. And so when the IMF was doing a bit of work a few years ago looking at markups in prices, which is a good proxy for how concentrated industries have become, the markups in this country were far worse than the global averages. So there's a real problem that we've got here, and so you're right to say that you've got to take on rent seeking much more aggressively. And one of the ways in which you do that is through industrial policy. And you know, we're making some timid steps in this direction as a government. That's good that we're gently moving in the right direction, but I think we've got to be a hell of a lot more radical about it. And crucially, the bit that is missing is pretty radical devolution of economic power and resource in a way that gets power and resource out of Westminster. And I think that's why the point that you made at the end there about social spaces is incredibly important. Ultimately, that local agency is really, really important. And then the point about, as we call them, Zs. So when you're doing your Labour Party marked registers, you mark down those who are not voting as a Z. This is exactly the kind of debate that we need to have. So you're right. I was interested in replicating Ben Ansell's work to see if it held true. I was very surprised at how close the relationship remained. And it's really hard to do in our country because our wealth data is so crap. I mean, even at that local constituency level, it's impossible to do that. You can take house prices as a proxy. You know, it's not a bad proxy, but does it tell you everything? No, it doesn't. And so as much as anything else, this is a cri de coeur to kind of say, look, that there appears to be something going on here, but can we just please look at this quite hard together over the next year or two, because there is so much at stake in us really understanding this. I happen to think, like you, that not voting is a political statement, and it would be we should try and replicate the research actually and see if some of the patterns hold true.
Thank you. Faiza, do you want to answer anything?
Yeah, thank you. I've probably read some of the same things as you, Liam, on the through history when those moments have been, and so there's
Walter Schneidel, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a bit called Tax the Rich that goes into this, and it's kind of depressing, this point. But one thing I would say about sort of the post-war era, in which you did see wealth inequality overall decline, and you saw more social housing, etc. Now, what were those conditions? It was a sense of togetherness that had come off the back of that war. Yes, there was a disaster, but there was a sense of connection to each other across class lines that made it easier for a government to come in and do progressive things without backlash. I mean, there was some backlash, but they were able to do it because the vast majority of people supported it in that moment. So what other things can we do to, give that sense? But also the other big thing was things like trade unions. Too often we have these conversations and we talk about change from the top. And often change doesn't come from the top, and people, if you really want an empowered public, it's not just going along and listening to them now and then. Actually, you need them to have power, and they need different ways in which to use that power and to push back. And that period of decline in inequality was not coincidentally a time of which high membership of trade unions and collective bargaining. And we still see that in countries around the world, actually, countries that have been able to withstand market forces that have pushed inequality higher, almost everywhere. They tend to have some sort of collective bargaining structure. Just in terms of voting and reform, I think, only 52% of people that could vote voted in this election, which is really not good for democracy. And, people talk a lot about the working class vote in the US and Trump, and the working class vote here in reform. But actually, a lot of the working class are just not voting. And, I spent years knocking on doors, and the level of despondency has got worse, for sure. But what is the point of voting no one cares about me, no one's going to deliver. You know, the lack of trust in our political institutions is just like rock bottom, and various different polling shows this. Again, it's not just a problem that we have, it's something everywhere. And this is why I worry, even as an economist, about some of the growth push, because having lived in the US under Biden, they kind of went quite hard on things like kind of trying to push on big investment, etc. And actually, when you look at it, you know, the reason that kind of Harris was disconnected is that she was sort of talking about America doing well, and like being better performing than other high income countries, but that growth didn't deliver for people, and it didn't deliver for people fast enough because we're so far behind. And the current model of, yes, building more housing, which again, you know, is a good thing, but building more housing using the same private sector development model that has failed for the last 20 years, right, 30 years, well, where is that going to take us? So I do think who's voting, why they're voting, or why they're not voting needs to be taken way more seriously and understood as not just as a pushback on the system, but on the political system, but also a consequence of who the economy is working for. Yeah, and your point about community, yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about it in the book. Like, I just think ultimately the sorts of change that we need to see are moving away from individual models of building wealth to more community wealth. And the example I use in the book of like connecting with people and how few spaces are left is when I spent weeks in intensive care when my mum had a heart transplant, and talking to other people in the room, right, regardless of their politics, regardless of how they had voted, there was a connection that came from just human empathy. And we need more spaces to do that. And it sounds cheesy, but actually that's the basis of, you know, feeling like you belong in society, feeling connected to each other, and feeling like, you know, change can happen.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, something that I read today or yesterday, they're going to close down Billingsgate and Smithfield markets. Is that right?
City of London Corporation.
Yeah, the City of London Corporation, which is, I don't know if you are aware, it's the only part of Britain where you don't get to, individuals can't vote for the local council. So this is, the City of London Corporation is, the voting members are the businesses who are located in the City of London. And they've decided that this institution, which is part of the economy, but also a part of the sort of social and cultural fabric of London, as well as being the place that supplies my local fish shop, so I have a kind of personal stake in this, just can be ripped up because they can make more money by doing something else. And it just occurred to me, we've seen Nigel Farage and people like that in these demonstrations against the farm inheritance tax. I can't imagine they're going to be taking part in those, in any protests against this move. I think this is an opening for progressive people, right? In the end, it is clear that from Trump to Farage and most of the European far-right movements as well, these are movements that claim the votes of the poor, but represent the rich. And, you know, and part of the reason they get away with it is because, of course, traditional parties of the center-left have failed to represent the kind of people who are struggling, right? And this is clearly, there's not an easy answer to that because, of course, you know, radical left movements have not necessarily prospered in this environment either. So it's not so straightforward. But I think there is one quick fix, and I'm not trying to get you to click on an internet link here. There is one quick fix that can solve part of this problem, and that is electoral reform. No government with a majority of 100 and how many it is very likely to change the electoral system. But if you look at the places where the crazy populists representing wealthy interests and doing all kinds of generally bad things for the rest of us, but with the votes of the poor, they only ever actually get their hands on the levers of power in first past the post electoral system. Trump would not win power in a PR system. Brexit wouldn't have happened in a PR system, even though it was a majority vote. I can elaborate if you're interested. So how do you, and why did Bidenomics fail as a political project? Because 4 years wasn't long enough to do these things. in a very, very challenging environment. When you have PR, you have the opportunity to build coalitions around broad-based policy programs with broad appeal that can last. Okay, so in Britain, we tend to think that PR is a source of instability because we look at Italy, or, you know, the coalition government in Germany just broke down. Oh, PR, it's chaos. But actually, what have we had here for the last 14 years, right? What are we going to have in the United States over the next 4 years? So honestly, there's a lot of evidence that PR is very closely correlated with progressive outcomes. And I think Britain it's never going to happen in the US, I think, but it could happen here. And we really need to push for this. We really need to push for it. There are people in Labour who want this. Obviously, the leadership, I'm almost certain, don't, for obvious reasons. But if the next election is not going to be as easy as this last one, so maybe they can be persuaded. I don't know. But I think this is something we need to talk about. Getting the right policies depends a lot on the institutions that choose who governs and how.
Thank you. So I think we have time for at least one more round of questions. Yeah, should we go in the front here?
Good evening. My name is Raheem, and I'm a Year 12 student from sixth form. And my question is a bit more basic, but my question is, what should the ordinary person that maybe doesn't have the ability to impose taxes on that 1%, what should that person do to help play their part in solving this national issue of wealth inequality?
Kim? You over there, yeah? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Corinna Ferros. I'm head of sociology at St Anne's Sixth Form, St Anne's School. What do we do about more and more people using the same search engine across the world, buying your wonderful books, I'm sure partly from the same site we all know so well, flying with the same airlines, eating the same burgers? I mean, no wonder some people are getting filthy rich in the world.
Okay, and in the blue jacket there.
Yeah. Miles Forsyth-Hopkin, I was a student here a few years ago in economics. And as an economics student, I want to take offense to your graph at the beginning of the three different stories of wealth inequality growing 100-fold, because it strikes me that this growth in wealth is more of a asset price inflation actually than an increase in the wealth of things that we have. And so rather it's not long run aggregate supply increasing, but rather just aggregate demand going up massively. And so the issue more so is, like Jonathan was saying, investing to push aggregate supply outwards so that we can actually build the wealth for the country, and doing this in a sort of equitable way. And so my question is the role that the private sector has in benefiting, working towards that investment, because a lot of that wealth is captured in private equity. And so, yeah, obviously the public sector has a priority to maximize well-being of the public and invest in those things, but what responsibility does the private sector also have to?
Thank you. If we're quick with the supply, we can get another round of questions in. Yeah, Faiza, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, what can an ordinary person do? That was a great question. Thank you. Yeah, there are a few things. So, and it depends on what you care about. So, for instance, if there's a local renters union and you want to help people from being thrown out of their housing, and you can get involved in those sorts of things, like actively participating by being part of the stand against something, like literally turning up and being a body at a protest or at something like that, is actually really powerful, and it gets you involved. It gives you a community of people that can tell you then what else you can do. But also, yeah, using your voice, talking to people. I always say to people, you know, we're told never to talk about politics. Talk about politics. Actually talk about it with people in your family. And I'm not saying fall out with them, but, you know, find ways to have these conversations and to find ways to build consensus, you know, challenge ideas. There are things you can certainly do. on Google, Amazon, yeah, no, it's a really important point. I think there's some good work that's been done on Amazon in terms of trying to build up kind of trade union membership inside, although they are, you know, really harsh about it. I think I'm really interested in boycott campaigns. Part of the reason I got blocked running from Labour is like tweeting about, well, a long time ago, tweeting about boycotting companies that are doing the wrong thing, that are treating their workers badly, that are supplying weapons to dodgy countries, that are, you know, all of those things. And I think we need to emphasize that you don't have to use Amazon, and there are alternatives, and we need to, as much as possible, push those. But certainly governments should be regulating way more. Yeah, definitely, Liam mentioned Lena Khan in the US. I hope she retains her job under Trump. I don't know what the likelihood is of that, but look at some of the things that she's been doing and pushing to ensure these markets are regulated. I'll let others talk about the role of the private sector. What I would say is that, you know, of course, the private sector so often actually runs the deals, even with government, local government. I've like heard it, seen it, that governments and local authorities, etc., public sector get scared and thinks, okay, well, we'll just like cave into what the private sector demands. You need a very strong sense of what you need from the private sector, and you have to be really brave in setting boundaries about how much profits they can make. And in some cases, like housing, I've seen models around the world where instead of using private developers, or in order to limit how they behave, they've created like a publicly owned construction company, for instance. So I think some of this is quite interesting in what Ed Miliband is doing on the energy markets. It could potentially be good and do some of these things. So yeah, the private sector has a role, but right now, and from what I've seen, it's too much of a leading role when really they should be. Mariana Mascati does a lot of stuff on this, and that I think she's really right about how they should be used.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, what to do about the private sector? I mean, I think, you know, in this country, we've listened a lot about, you know, for years and years, about how the government can't do anything well, the government's inefficient, they're wasting money. Of course, the Trump administration has this waste unit that Elon Musk, of all people, is going to be running, you know, trying to cut spending. And we really don't talk enough about how useless some parts of the private sector are. And actually, the evidence for this is that a lot of what the government is supposed to do, it's contracted out to the private sector. From bin collections to, you know, running the security at major events to, you know, there are private sector companies, some very, very big ones, who have now, I mean, I can't remember the examples off the top of my head, but there's an example of a company that failed so miserably to meet the expectations and the massive contract it had signed. But this wasn't allowed to be taken into account in any future contracts that the government gave out, because apparently the regulations mean that you have to ignore all past performance. So these people have actually got the government in a stranglehold. And when somebody was talking about the rentier capitalism, Brett Christophers, who's a sociologist in Sweden, but I think he's British, has written a great book on this. And I mean, there's a huge amount of this wealth, which is, you know, rents, and rents not in the literal sense of the rent you pay as a landlord for a room or whatever, although they are included in rents, but generally unearned profits which are beyond what a fair market system would provide. This seems to be a very major problem in Britain. And there are kind of, you know, as American economists say, big bills left on the sidewalk. There are easy wins there. These people are wasting taxpayers' money and not doing their job properly. The government could very often do it just as well, if not better. The East Coast Railway line is a good example of this. You know, when the franchisee failed, the government stepped in, performed very, very well, but they weren't allowed, you know, a public provider wasn't allowed to bid for the contract because of this ideological obsession with putting things out to the private sector. I think the British private sector isn't very good. It doesn't invest. The government hasn't been investing enough either. I think the government has to take control of this situation and, you know, force the private sector to, you know, to face some serious competition.
Thank you.
Let me just start with the last question first. So you're right. So the household wealth stats that ONS published are a reflection of asset prices. But what I could have shown on that graph is the change now in the wealth to wages curve. And the challenge we've got, when I was born, national household wealth was 3 times national labour income. Now, household wealth, net household wealth is 10 times national labour income. So that means that those asset prices that are kind of bound up and represented by that figure, they're just way, way more expensive given the level of wages to pay for those assets. And so the challenge is that assets are just now massively more expensive compared to what people earn than they were, back when I was born. Now, part of the argument in the book is that you've definitely got to rebuild public services in a couple of ways. So one, you've got to do a lot in the innovation space if you're to get economic growth in the future. There's a bunch of things that you've got to do to change the way that the market works in this country so that you've got wages that are going up as a share of national income. But it's a myth to think that you can build your way out of an asset boom. Because even if we say doubled the number of houses that we were building each year, actually the impact on house prices would be pretty marginal. They would still be completely unaffordable for most young people going to work. So although you should be doing that, you have got to do that, it would be naive to think that that is going to solve the problem. You've ultimately got to tackle this problem that every successive generation since World War II has earned less than the previous generation. And that is partly why confidence in democracy amongst young people is so diminished now, because our economy is simply not working for young people. And so I guess if the book is one thing, it's a kind of, it is intended as a provocation to kind of say, well, look, what are we going to do as a country about this? Are we simply going to stand by and watch the younger generation get poorer and poorer and poorer, where assets continue to become further and further from their reach? Or are we going to try and do something about it? Are we going to change the economy? Are we going to rebuild the way our public services work? So there should be assets as insurance, as Jonathan says, but there's also got to be assets as agency. Your agency is multiplied if you've got wealth and resilience that you don't have today. On oligopoly, I kind of agree with what you've heard so far. I suppose you've got to break up a lot of these oligopolies that we've got today. And I think we've just got to be a lot more aggressive about the fact that a lot of these oligopolies are actually built in the United States and indeed in China. And actually, as a small open economy, they both show up on our shores. We're having a debate in Parliament today about electric vehicles, for example. You're getting huge subsidies in Chinese firms that ultimately mean that these cars are dumped at below market cost in the UK. Actually, that is probably one of the reasons that Stellantis has just closed its major plant in Luton today at the cost of 1,100 jobs. Are we launching an anti-subsidy investigation like the EU? No, we're not. Should we be? Well, yeah, probably. So we're just going to need a kind of a tougher competition regime than we've got today. But all of this requires politics to change it. And that's why I thought that first question is just so, so important. I mean, Faiza kind of lit this up, I thought, really well. Ultimately, the populists that we're contending with today, they're not nationalists, although their language is often nationalistic. They're tribalists. What they're trying to do is to pit one bit of society against another. They are trying to prosecute the politics of divide and rule. Why? Because it's worked for centuries. That is what they are trying to do today. And I suppose that is why what we have to do, what progressives have to do, is to rebuild that sense of solidarity and social action, kind of one group at a time. When I think about where we've made real progress in my constituency, since I've been the MP, we brought in £650 million of new investment in hospitals, health centres, new schools, classrooms, new parks. Every single one of those projects began with a few people in a room, where we were bringing communities together, we were defining agendas, we were mobilising for action. And none of that change was delivered overnight. But without that force of collective action, you can achieve literally nothing. And that's where we need the ingenuity, the creativity, and the sheer brilliance of Gen Z today
to supply that new generation for a new politics, for a new time.
That's a rousing note on which I think we need to finish, because we are at the clock. I know lots of you wanted to ask some questions. The good news, I think, is certainly Liam and Faiza will be outside signing books. Jonathan, no doubt,
No copies available.
but you can carry on these conversations to some extent outside the room with the three speakers. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the wonderful panel. I think this is a great discussion, and these are such important issues. We just need to really make these central to political debate. Thanks to everybody. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the panel.